بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الذي خلق الخلائق بقدرته، ثم الصلاة والسلام على رسوله وأمينه خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of here and the hereafter, the one who created everything through His majesty and power. We convey our greeting and salutation to the Holy Prophet of Islam, the most noble of all prophets and the seal of all prophets, and his pure progenies. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the 16th program within the 2021 Ramadan series. Inshallah, you are all well and safe. As usual, we begin with a brief recap of the main points last night. The focus of our conversation last night was a response to a question that was posed, that since we are talking about the life of the Holy Prophet, particularly the image that is being presented as humanistic image, there are a number of questions or criticism labeled against his character. One of them was regarding the marriage to al-Mu'mineen Aisha. Is it true that what most Sunni scholars claim, that she was the engagement took place at the age of 6 and she moved into Prophet household at the age of 9. I primarily focused on the sources of the Sunni sources, and more towards Bukhari than any other references, and pointed out that if we were to focus just on that particular book and look at ahadith that exist in that book, we'll see that this prevailing understanding of that story is nothing more than a myth, because the evidence clearly support that she was born before the call or before the proclamation. At best, she was born probably a year or so before the proclamation, not 4 or 5 years before. If we were to consider that because of some statements by herself, confession that she was present and she remembered her father's departure towards Habasha, and she remembered a number of verses, particularly Surah Al-Qamar that was revealed, and at that time she remembered few of the ayat. Not to mention the fact that At-Tabari states that Abu Bakr had 2 wives, and from each of them had 2 children, and they were born before the proclamation of the Holy Prophet. They were born during Jahiliyyah, or before Islam. Certainly, Asma, which is her oldest sister, at the time of migration and Hijrah, she was 27. And according to historians, she was older than Aisha by 10 years. So that puts her around the age of 17 at the time of migration, and at the age of 19 when she got married. So this is certainly not something that agrees with the one hadith that is narrated from her by herself. Tonight, I want to follow the theme that we had talked before. And that was, we presented the life of the Holy Prophet, and we indicated that one of the factors that led to the success of his leadership was his akhlaq. There is a hadith narrated from the Holy Prophet. ثلاث من مكارم الأخلاق يصل من قطعك وتعطي من حرمك وتعفو عمن ظلمك. Or تصل من قطعك وتعطي من حرمك وتعفو عمن ظلمك. 3 characters or traits that are among the high morals. To keep in contact with those who have severed their relationship with you, so you try to rekindle the relationship. To give to those who refuse helping you, and to forgive those who have been unjust to you. This hadith, or what we call a hadith about akhlaq and makarim al-akhlaq, high morals, are repeatedly stated in different books and different sources. This is just only one of the hadith that we have. The most famous of this is Du'a Makarim al-Akhlaq, which is narrated from Imam Zain al-Abidin salawatullah salamu alayhi, and possibly the most authentic book, because according to the historians, they say Zayd, his son, that later on was killed, and the Zaydi movement in Islam, which focuses in Yemen at the moment, are somehow associated with his life. He had a copy of it that he recorded from his father's, so these are dua and supplication that his father had narrated, and now it's been compiled in a book. It's called Du'a Makarim al-Akhlaq, and part of Sahifa Sajjadiyah and other books. The supplication lists all the behavior that one has to do as a Muslim, part of our responsibility towards high moral. But before we get to that book and explain what we have to submit, I think a brief analysis of the word khulq and akhlaq, the plural akhlaq and the word khulq, might be helpful. The practice of virtue within Islamic theology, manners and virtue within our life. Although when we go to the Quran, it is used primarily in reference to Prophet Muhammad's exemplary ethical character, and yet Quran also emphasizes the significance of ethically guided action as underpinning for a committed Muslim life. We really can't have a Muslim life if our action is devoid of ethical and moral behavior. Quranic ethics emphasizes that the source of the akhlaq, or ethical and moral value, is human dignity. Human dignity being the essence of everything. And if we look within the Quran, we come across accountability, justice, care, compassion, stewardship of society, and a number of others. But human dignity is the essential component of everything that is the essence of ethical and moral behavior. So what we have in the Holy Quran, we collect all of this. The verses in the Holy Quran, if they were added to, or the ahadith were added to the verses in the Holy Quran, they certainly underscore that the faith and ethic are intertwined. They are not separated from each other. If we remember with regard, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. So if ethical and moral behavior falls within the good deeds, certainly the relationship with faith, it's essential. Intertwined, these are part and parcel of the same thing. But there is a question that people pose. Exactly what is akhlaq? Broadly, we can talk about the high morals, ethical and moral behavior. But exactly what it is, and it's just not only on the basis of deeds, on the basis of thoughts as well. What makes a thought acceptable and another one unacceptable? What makes an action, deed acceptable and another one unacceptable? What makes an action ethical and another one unethical or immoral? So this is what the gist of the argument. Unfortunately, starting from Greek time and Greek philosophers up to today, despite debate by scholars, philosophers, thinkers, that they have pondered on coming up with a unique understanding of akhlaq from Socrates up to today. Even in the West, you just go and find out, Google and say ethics. Huge literature exists, and the debate between one type of ethics versus another type of ethics. One philosopher's understanding of ethics, another philosopher's understanding of ethics. So up to now, we really have no consensus, a clear definition that say, this is the meaning of akhlaq or ethics that everyone agrees upon. In Islam, we look at our own philosophers, we see the same thing. There are those that mystically orientated, and they consider ethics and akhlaq as an inner orientation or awareness for guiding human action that leads to closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the spiritual understanding. The legal mind, which is, we call them the jurist, the primary understanding or the principle by which they designate something, whether it is ethical or moral, is whether it falls within the 4 or 5 categories, the legal category of wajib, haram, makruh, mustahab, and indifferent. So if one's behavior falls within the wajibat and mustahabbat, then it's considered to be ethical and moral. If it falls within muharramat, certainly is immoral. Somewhere in the middle, it's neither makruh, detested, or mustahab or something else, is ordinary action. That's for the jurists. Philosophers have created, Islamic philosophers have created their own ethical and moral principles. You have, similar to the Christian philosophers or that wrote a book regarding the city of man, Augustine, city of man and city of God. Under what condition people who inhabit the city of God make them the true inhabitants of the city of God, the moral principle that they have to observe. We have similar kind of Ahmadiyya al-Fadila within Islam, that although they take ideas from the Greek philosophers, what they convert them and come up with some kind of a unique understanding. Mystics, they have a list of principles that they use for that. What comes clear from when we look at these literature, that even in the West, when we look at the Western philosophers' understanding of ethics and morality, what is clear is that worldview plays a major role in the way we understand Islam, akhlaq. A materialistic materialistically oriented individual looks at, even when they talk about ethics and morality, they look at it in a unique way than, say, somebody who's inclined towards religion, faith, and the hereafter. Those who are materialistically inclined, and they say what exists in this world, their moral code of behavior is narrowed down to something with personal freedom, will not somehow intervene or subject other or counters other personal freedom. The rest of that, you can do whatever you want. You are morally free. But those who are, they consider themselves to be faithful and faith-orientated, we see that their approach is totally different. From an Islamic point of view, I really am trying to be as brief as possible, because I don't want to spend the next 3 or 4 nights arguing about various opinions and ideas that exist in Islam regarding akhlaq and moral behavior. From an Islamic viewpoint, akhlaq is a set of actions because Islam considers the dignity and honor that is given to the soul as paramount. So anything that demeans the soul and denigrates the soul and moves the soul away from the source of the reality, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is considered to be unethical. Akrim nafsaka an kull daniyah. You give by committing sins or doing certain things that removes the dignity from the soul, that's the foundation of akhlaq that we should stay away from. We have discussed in the past, during the few nights before, that the story of Genesis talks to us that humans are made up of form and soul. What matters in the characteristics or building of the one individual is not the soul outside. It's not the form outside, it's the soul that matters, because that's the sacred reality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has infused in us. So Islamic ethics found itself based on that dignity and honor that intrinsically exists in all human beings, because they contain the nafs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blown into their form. Amir al-Mu'mineen Imam Hassan has a hadith: لا تكن عبد غيرك وقد جعلك الله أو خلقك الله حرا. Anything that demeans the initial freedom and dignity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created in you and creates an attachment outside that dignity, don't do it. So that frame of reference is what ultimately comes to be in agreement with that dignity that exists in a human being, or against it. God has created you free. Don't be slave to anyone or anything else, because anything else goes against that dignity. So in human being, from the conversation that we have had in the past, there are 2 characteristics. There is one characteristic or one reality that takes you towards God, and another reality that takes you towards evil, shaitan, and everything else. If we consider what moves somebody towards Allah is nafs at least lawama and mutma'inna, and what moves human towards lower status and shaitan is nafs al-ammara. So these 2 nafs. Anything that strengthen the power of nafs al-ammara on one's soul and ultimately removes us from getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is immoral. Whether they fall within the category of haram or anything else. If, in essence, when I ask myself, is this moral or is it not moral? The next question is, by doing this, am I getting to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an abd and servant? Submit to the command of Allah, or I'm going to go away? Or I'm going to be submitting to the command of shaitan? These two answers ultimately would inform me that this action is moral or immoral. In a nutshell, simplistically put, we don't want to get into some kind of philosophical discussion or spiritual or mystical discussion. No. Humans, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created them with a soul. The form are secondary, the soul that matters. The form we are going to leave behind and depart. The soul is the reality. On the Day of Judgment, this action is going to create a negative image on that soul, or is it going to create a positive image? Backbiting, I debate whether it's moral or immoral. I ask the same question. Negative thoughts in our mind vis-a-vis somebody else, I ask the same question. By entertaining and maintaining these ideas, am I going to go towards the negative or am I going to go towards the positive? There is a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi, man karumat alayhi nafsuh, hanat alayhi shahawatuh. If you value your dignity, if you value your soul, you're not going to pay attention to following of shahawat and nafs al-ammara, and ego. Very simple. So when we debate and struggle with ourselves, should I do this or shouldn't? Is this a moral act or is it not, or is it an immoral act? I think what we have to ask ourselves, by doing this act, am I, according to the verse in the Holy Quran, am I going to do tazkiyah of the soul and elevate myself, or am I going to sink further towards asfal as-safili? Which one? There is a hadith from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salawatullah salam alayhi, أُثَامِنُ بِالنَّفْسِ النَّفِيسَةِ رَبَّهَا. The thaman, the value of this unique treasure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to us and exists in our soul, in our reality, the true value of it is when it turns towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing else. I'm not prepared to sell this soul for anything else but Allah. So, the argument as to whether something is moral or immoral ultimately comes down to the fact that does it help me to return to God and get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or does it take me away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Remember, we talked about this a few nights before, that our life is nothing more than the story of the return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how we are going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment. Because there is no way out of that reality. كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ. Whether we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah, for the use of a better word, smiles in our face, in the picture of blessing merciful, or we are going to see the wrathful side of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the punishing. That depends on our deed. And those deeds, call them what you want. Call them ethical, moral, immoral, according to the Sharia, outside the Sharia, haram, wajib, mustahab. These are they don't matter. What matters is the gist of the issue. The gist of the issue is when I ask myself, does this supports my the honor and dignity of a human being, or goes against it? By doing this, am I getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because ultimately, there is another hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah wassalamu alayhi that says the worth of an individual is what we struggle for. If somebody comes to me and says how much a human being is worth, Amir al-Mu'mineen says, find out what they are struggling for in their life. If they are struggling for cars and a house and something, that's their worth. If they are struggling for a job and an income, that's their worth. If they are struggling for a position or something, that's their worth. But if they are struggling for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are priceless. Why? Because ultimately, the true value of this soul that Allah has infused in our form, the true value only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, nobody else. Don't sell it cheap to anybody. The only buyer, true buyer, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the moral acts and ethical acts are those that gets us close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or gets us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we ask ourselves, should we do this or don't, the do's and the don'ts, if by doing it we get closer to Allah, then naturally it's moral and ethically acceptable. If it takes us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is fundamentally unacceptable. So nafs al-ammara is the criteria. Whatever gets us close to nafs al-ammara, we have to reject as immoral, and whatever takes us away from nafs al-ammara is the one which is moral. So we go back to the hadith at the beginning that I recited, in which the Holy Prophet says there are three characteristics or traits. تَصِلُ مَنْ قَطَعَكَ. Just pay attention. Nafs al-ammara commands me that this person has stopped communicating with me for 6 months or a year. I don't want to see him or her or anybody else. That's what nafs is. But what about if I go against nafs al-ammara and the person is not responding, I move towards it. This is what nafs al-ammara doesn't want, finds it very difficult. وَتُعْطِي مَنْ حَرَمَكَ. You go to someone during the hours of need and you say, so and so, I desperately need your help. They turn away and they don't help you. Life goes around. Then you are in a position of power, position of wealth, or anything else. Now the other person happened to be in a situation that you were in. He says, don't deny that person because they denied you support. This is again, nafs al-ammara doesn't want it. On an egocentric world that everything is for me and I'm the center of the gravity, it would say, no. You ask that person, they refuse, ignore it. But this hadith says no. Worse still, the most difficult thing, وَتَعْفُوا عَمَّنْ ظَلَمَكَ. Somebody who has been unjust to you. Then when your time comes and you have the power to forgive them for what they have done. When to respond in kind, they have been unjust and I will be unjust to them, that you haven't done much. That's not the elevation of the soul. For them to be unjust and for me to be just in return. هل جزاء الإحسان إلا الإحسان is the basic minimum, that at least when somebody has been kind to you, you respond in kindness. That's not the criteria that shows the clarity of the soul and the purity of the inner, the purity of the heart. When somebody does something bad to you and you respond with kindness, when somebody denies you something and when the time comes, you respond and you don't deny them anything. They try to stay away from you, you go towards them. And there are a number of others. These are some of the critical characters that shows your honor and dignity of one's soul. Only when you are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you are asking for reward from Allah, then it doesn't matter what other people think. Well, for some of you, tonight is the first night of power. Those who started month of Ramadan on Tuesday. So tonight is the first night of power. And then these are very unique nights in which the opportunities are extra than the usual month of Ramadan to really search and cleanse our soul and heart, make commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and try to eradicate some of the negative traits that we have not been able to deal with, and gain some of the positive traits that we should have done by now. One of the major recommendations by Ahlul Bayt during these nights is that to pray, going back to ethical and moral behavior, to pray for others and don't pray for yourself. Let others pray for you. You don't pray for yourself. So let's make it a habit during these nights that we spend our time getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in our prayers, whatever we do, we ask for the well-being of the other members of our community, because there are a huge number of people who are in desperate need of prayer from everybody else. May Allah protect all of you and grant you the privilege during these nights to be able to go through this even little bit of change that if we have not been able to accomplish anything so far. And pray for everybody else, inshallah. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.